Our knowledge is part of a lineage of wisdom that links us with our past. And we know that that link, the link that ties us with those who have come before us, has been broken at least 2 times in recorded history. Twice in recorded history, something happened, an event occurred, and we lost information. And in some instances, it's information pertaining precisely to what we're doing right now. The first one of those breaks was with the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria in the 4th century. While we don't know precisely what was in that library, what we do know is that Roman historians had cataloged volumes and volumes of information. Scrolls is the way that the material was written at that time. The Roman historian Callimachus, for example, cataloged over 536,000 scrolls in the Great Library of Alexandria before it was burned, and many of them were very ancient in that time, in the 4th century. And we know that the scrolls contain some of the most ancient documents of the Hebraic, ancient Hebrew traditions, of the Egyptian astronomical traditions and medical traditions, much of the wisdom that had been passed down from thousands of years earlier, describing our relationship to our world, to one another, and perhaps to something even greater. When that library burned, we know we lost tremendous amounts of information then. And the second time was with the edits of the Western biblical texts, the biblical traditions in the 4th century as well, in the year 325 AD. It was during this time in the early Christian traditions when the Emperor Constantine pulled together a council. And at that time, there was no biblical text, nice, neat, compiled text the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Council, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?" And the result of that was what we call today our Western biblical text, biblical tradition. We know that at least 20 books were completely removed, and another 20 to 25 were tremendously edited, and the remaining texts were condensed and rearranged into what we see today as our biblical text. So as good as our Bible is today, the best biblical scholars will openly and freely admit that it is incomplete. And we know this because we're finding these documents in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. This is why they were so controversial. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, we were able to see many of these books in their original form. Some of them hadn't been seen for 1,700 years. And interestingly, many of the books that were edited or taken out completely are precisely the documents that describe our relationship to the universe and the creation around us through the power of human emotion.
Over 51 centuries ago, our ancestors did their very best to inform and warn us of what they knew would be an era of powerful transition in a future they could only imagine in their dreams. That era is now, and the transition has already begun. To understand their message is to understand our journey through the heavens and time, and it's all about cycles. Time Code 2 reminds us that our ancestors recorded their experience of the last end of time, showing us beyond reasonable doubt that the close of one world age is the beginning of the next and not the end of the world. The very nature of a cycle is that it repeats itself. So every time the end of one cycle appears, by definition, it's also the beginning of the next. The key here is that to get to the beginning of what's new, the cycle must pass through the end of what already exists. And while this repeating nature of cycles is obvious on the small scale of things like seasons of the year and phases of the moon, it's not always so obvious when we're talking about cosmic cycles like solar systems moving through the galaxy. This is where the message of our Mayan ancestors comes in. They recognized the nature of time cycles long before science described our journey through the heavens. Their timekeepers preserved what they knew and incorporated it into stories about the universe and life, non-scientific descriptions of creation and destruction, birth and death. While the specifics regarding the end of time vary across tradition, culture, and religious belief, there's a common theme that seems to run through all of them, almost universally. Ancient predictions for our time in history describe an age filled with an epic darkness. From the Hindu descriptions of the great yugas, to the Mayan long count marking the remaining days of the current great cycle. The close of our age has been prophesied, predicted, feared, and anticipated as an era of war, suffering, excess, and inequality. And while these descriptions sound ominous, there is a bright side. Although the darkness appears to be necessary, it also appears to be brief. The reason? Physically, our solar system is moving through the shortest part of an orbit called an ellipse. The shape is important because it looks like a flattened circle, and our journey has carried us to the most distant point in our orbit from the center of our home galaxy, the Milky Way. Both ancient traditions and modern science tell us that our location in this cyclic orbit determines how we experience the powerful sources of energy that radiate from our galaxy's core. Energy like the massive magnetic fields that have been recently discovered there. New studies suggest that it's precisely such cycles that influence the quality of life on Earth and may explain the mysterious rise and fall of life here on our planet, even the mass extinctions that happened 250 and 450 million years ago. Additionally, modern discoveries now confirm that our planet's position throughout the journey, things like orbit, tilt, and wobble, create the ever-changing cycles that influence everything from the temperature and climate to polar ice and the magnetic fields of Earth. The key here is that our location in these cycles also appears to have a direct emotional and spiritual effect upon us. As we travel further from our galaxy's core, the same ancient traditions that describe the cycles also describe how we sense our distance from the galaxy's energy source, as a sense of a loss of connection, one that we experience both spiritually and emotionally. Scientific links between the quality of Earth's magnetic fields, how they're affected by cosmic conditions, and our sense of well-being seem to support precisely such ancient beliefs. In the same way that Earth's rotation makes the darkest part of the night appear just before the dawn, our position in the heavens makes the darkest part of our world age appear just before our heavenly orbit begins the return that brings us closer to the light of our galaxy's core. With that return, we experience relief from the cataclysmic forces of the cycles of darkness. And just as the night must pass to get to the new day, the only way to get to the light of the next cycle is to finish the darkness of this one. Students of the Mahabharata suggest that the massive text describes a great war that was fought in the valley that marks the precise location of the new discoveries. The remains are now dated at approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years old, placing them into the time frame of the two world ages of the past. While such discoveries obviously warrant more study, we can learn from what we do know of them so far. When we understand what the darkness of our cycle has meant in the past, and why it's necessary, we begin to see the great challenges of our time in the new light. And with that light, our time in history and our response to the changes that come with it take on new meaning. With these ideas in mind, it becomes even clearer that now is the best time for us to go through such a cycle. The reason is because now is the first time we've had the understanding, the need, and the technology to reach into the realm of all possibilities and choose the kind of future that will arise from the chaos of the present. The reason is because now is the first time we have the understanding, the need, and the technology to reach into the realm of all possibilities and choose the kind of future that will arise from the chaos of the present. This is something that would have been impossible even 50 years ago. Looking closely at the stories and records that have been handed down to us for over 250 generations, it becomes obvious that those who experienced the end of the last world age worked hard to make sure that we know precisely what it means to do so. We find the fruits of their labor preserved for us today in their temples, texts, traditions, and cultures. Although the ancient creation stories, such as those of the Hopi, Hindu, and Mayan cultures, differ in specifics, they generally agree when it comes to the cyclic nature of the universe. They state that at least 3 great worlds have existed in the past and been destroyed before the one that we're living in today. While different traditions use different signs to tell us where we are in our world age cycle, it seems that all the signs are essentially telling us the same thing. The shift from the present age into the next one is now, in our lifetime. What sets the Mayan calendar apart from the oral traditions such as the Hopi is that their timeline for the shift ends on a specific date, while their system of calendars accurately identifies the alignment that marks the shift, a rare astronomical configuration that modern computers have actually confirmed. It's what the Maya knew about Earth's journey through the heavens that makes their story even more astounding. Specifically, they knew that during a zone of time before and after the 2012 winter solstice, Earth and our entire solar system would move into a position that is extraordinary by any standards. It's during this time that we move across an imaginary line that defines the two halves of our disc-shaped galaxy. Just the way the equator of the Earth divides the northern and southern hemispheres, the equator-like line that we cross in the Milky Way separates the top of the galaxy's disk from the bottom. As the planets of our solar system line up with one another and our Sun, our crossing of the galaxy's equator also aligns us with the mysterious source of energy that lies at the heart of the Milky Way. The Mesoamerican scholar John Major Jenkins was among the first to recognize the significance of this alignment as the completion of the great cycle indicated by the Mayan calendar. Because of the size and distances of heavenly bodies, to us here on Earth this alignment appears as a slow, gradual shift over a period of time. Our familiar experience of an eclipse is a perfect illustration of how such a gradual shift occurs. If you've ever watched a lunar eclipse, for example, probably didn't take long to discover that it wasn't going to be over quickly. Once it began, you could go back into the house, fix a cup of tea, make a couple of phone calls, and feed the pets before going back outdoors to see the completion of the progress. Even though the Earth is hurtling through space at a speed of about 65,000 miles per hour, on the night of a lunar eclipse, such enormous speeds aren't obvious. That's the effect of huge objects like planets moving through space at tremendous speeds across vast distances. To us, they look like they're in slow motion. When we marry the facts of today's science with the wisdom and the historic records of the past, we find a story that's almost beyond belief. It's the story of a journey, our journey, that began so long ago that it's taken over 256 generations and 5 millennia of time to reach the end. Now that we're doing so, we discover that the end is actually the start of a new journey. Perhaps poet and visionary T.S. Eliot best described the irony of an end being a beginning when he said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the very first time." While the story of a shifting world age based on our planet's orbit through the stars may sound like the plot of a Star Trek episode, the celestial calculations that our ancestors left to us are surprisingly consistent with the same scientific findings of today. When we put it all together, they tell the same story. And with that story, we suddenly have a new meaning for some of the great mysteries of our past, as well as the clues that tell us what to expect in our future. Fortunately, our ancestors left us everything we need to meet the challenges of a great world age.
Not only do they say that we are connected to the world around us, just the way Western science is now discovering, they invite us one step further, and they say, here's how you apply it in your life. They left us very, very clear instructions, saying this is the way you use this power, this inner technology within you, to bring about change in your world, to bring about healing in your body, to bring about peace in your families and in your communities, and collectively, as many people come together, these principles work as peace between nations as well. So now that science is beginning to tell us in its language, ancient spiritual traditions have shown us in their way, and in our own texts and documents, we're seeing references to precisely how these principles work. The question is, how do we apply them in our lives? How do we go about making use of this relationship between thoughts, feelings, and emotions inside of our bodies and what's happening in the world around us? Well, perhaps the best place to begin is by defining what a thought and a feeling and emotion really are. I've had this conversation with my mom many, many times. Mom always says to me, she goes, I always thought feelings and emotions were the same thing. And while they're closely related, there is a difference. So if we think of a chart, if you look at the ancient charts of the energy centers in our bodies, the chakra centers, if you will, what we see is the lower three energy centers of our bodies, they are closely associated with what we call the power of human emotion. And the ancients said we're capable of only two primary emotions. They said we're capable of the emotion of love, and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. Whether we think of that as fear or hate. And when you get really deep into the traditions, what we find is they are actually both polarities of the same force. So in those lower centers, the power of emotion, we have two primary experiences, love and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. This is a power, it's a force that drives us forward in life, and it tears down the walls, knocks down the barriers that stand between us and the things that we hold dear in our lives. Emotion, however, is scattered. It has to be focused. You can think of it as a power. If you know people who live strictly in their emotions, you know that sometimes their lives can be a little chaotic. Well, the emotions need to be focused, and this is where the power of thought or logic come in, and it's associated with the upper energy centers of the body. Thought is what gives focus or direction to the emotions. In other words, we have a thought about something. We have a thought about a cloudy day outside. And that thought, into that thought, we fuel the power of the emotion, either our love of that rainy day or our fear of what that rainy day may bring to us. And by doing so, when we marry the power of emotion with the direction of the thought, by virtue of that, we create a feeling. So feeling, by definition, is the union of emotion and the thought. And the one energy center, interestingly enough, that is not accounted for in all of the other systems, that remains unused in these ancient systems, is the heart center. And this is the one that is dedicated to the power of feeling. We feel in our hearts. So the feeling that we have in our hearts is the language that speaks to the field that Western science is now beginning to understand through their experiments. It's the power of human feeling that is the language that opens the door to the possibilities of what we create in our world. Well, scientists today, as they think about this field, it is so new, the idea is so new, that they've yet to agree even on a single term. Some scientists call this the quantum hologram. Some call it nature's mind. Dr. Ed Mitchell, former Apollo astronaut, calls this nature's mind. Scientists like Stephen Hawking call it the mind of God. As varied as the names appear to be, they're all speaking about essentially the same field, and they describe this field as a web or a net that underlies the fabric that links everything together. And it is this fabric, this web, this net, is what we speak to with the feelings in our bodies, with the feelings in our hearts. Ancient traditions not only recognized this relationship, they invite us one step further, and they left precise instructions in terms of how we apply this in our lives. In the late 1980s, I was an engineer working in the defense and aerospace corporations. I began exploring these concepts as an engineer, looking in the world around me to understand the history of those who have come before us. And it is that thinking that led me into the journeys of some of the most amazing places in the world, from the temples in Egypt, the Andes Mountains in Bolivia and Peru, into India and Nepal, the highlands of central China and Tibet, all through the American desert Southwest, searching for information and clues that would help us to understand how we relate to the world and how we can use this power of feeling, this power that speaks the language of the world around us. So as an engineer, when I began studying the principles of those who have come before us, the information that they left so that we could understand our relationship to the world around us and this ancient technology that today we call prayer, my thinking was that this kind of information would be best preserved in places that have been least disturbed by Western civilization. And this thinking led me into a journey, first time in 1998, into the highlands of central China, into Tibet, where we had the opportunity to explore 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries, speaking through the translators to those who actually live these principles in their lives. And this is the value of going to a place like Tibet, a living culture. We can go into temples in Egypt or temples, the Mayan temples in the Yucatan, and as fascinating as they are and as much information as they hold, the cultures that left that kind of information no longer exist. So at very best, we are speculating in terms of what they're saying to us. When we go into a monastery in Tibet, we can actually speak with the people who are there. We can ask them, when we see your prayers on the outside, what are you doing on the inside? What happens? What happens to your body? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you emoting? Well, it was in Tibet where I had the opportunity to meet with an abbot of one of the monasteries, and I asked him through the translator. Same thing we'd ask all of the monks and all of the nuns, and it was his answer that was so clear to me. And I asked him, when we see your prayers for 12 and 14 and 16 hours a day, when we see the mudras and the mantras and the bells and the bowls and the gongs and the chimes and the chants that you're doing in your prayers for so long on the outside, I said, what are you doing on the inside? What happens on the inside? And the abbot looked at me, and I like to think he was laughing with me. He may have been laughing at me, because he said through the translator again, he said, you've never seen our prayers, because a prayer cannot be seen. He said, what you have seen are the things that we do to create the feeling in our bodies. The feeling is the prayer. Then he turned the question on me, and he said, how do you do it in your culture? How do you do this in your culture? And I began to think about the way we think about prayer in our culture today. When we lost the texts that describe how the power of emotion and feeling are actually the language that connect us with the universe and the creation around us, we began to believe that words are simply the prayers. That if we say the right words, the right number of times, the right day of the year, the right time of day, that we've said the prayer. And as well-intentioned as those prayers may be, what we know is that there is a modality of prayer that carries us far beyond where simply offering the words will carry us. Western prayer researchers today identify 4 modalities of prayer. They say when we pray in the West, we use one or some combination of these 4 modes of prayer. The first is an informal prayer that's called a colloquial prayer. I had a friend of mine that lived in the Bay Area in San Francisco that would say this informal prayer coming home from work every Friday on the interstate. Dear God, if you let me get to the Conoco station before my tank runs out of gas, I'll never let my tank get this low again. And that is an informal prayer to God. The second mode of prayer is what is called a petitionary prayer, where we petition the powers to be. We petition the angels, or we petition God. Amen. Dear God, I claim the right to heal and be healed now in all past, present, future manifestations. That would be a petitionary kind of prayer. The third mode of prayer is a ritualistic prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. God is great. God is good. And the fourth mode of prayer is a prayer that has no words. It's simply a meditative prayer where we become aware of a presence around us and in the silence. And there's some dispute as to whether or not this is even a mode of prayer or not. But this is the way Western prayer researchers typically think of prayer in our world today. And as good as those modes are, and as well as they describe the way we pray, there's always been another mode, a fifth mode, that is not described in these modalities. And this is precisely what the abbot in Tibet was describing to us. He was describing a mode of prayer that's based in feeling. And he said, we must feel the feeling as if the prayer has already been answered. And in that feeling, we are speaking to the forces of creation, allowing the world to respond to us, allowing this field, the quantum hologram, the mind of God, to respond to us with what it is that we are feeling within our hearts. So, rather than praying and feeling powerless in a given situation, dear God, please let there be peace in the world, this mode of prayer invites us to feel as if we are participating in that peace, just as John Wheeler suggested, that we are part of all that we see. And as we feel the peace in our world or the healing in the bodies of our loved ones, we're actually empowering the field to mirror that back to us in a way that will bring those changes about in our lives and in our world. This is precisely what the abbot was saying to us in the monastery in Tibet. In the early 1990s, I had the opportunity to see this mode of prayer, this feeling-based prayer, enacted in a real-time situation. And I'd like to share the story because it best describes what otherwise is a nebulous concept regarding precisely how feeling-based prayer works in our lives. During the 1990s, early 1990s, the desert Southwest was experiencing one of the worst droughts in history. And a Native American friend of mine invited me to join him one day in a place in the high deserts in northern New Mexico. That afternoon, something amazing happened. I was watching the weather maps, and the drought that had happened for so long suddenly changed. We saw the high pressure system move across Utah and then dip down from Colorado into northern New Mexico and make a little U-turn and come right back up. We had rain that night. We had rain all the next day. It rained and rained, and I called my friend. And I asked him, I said, there's so much rain, the valleys are flooding, the roads are flooding. What in the world is going on? And he was quiet just for a moment, and he said, that's the part of the prayer. He said, I never quite figured out. So I have no way of scientifically validating that my friend's prayer had anything to do with that rain, but the correlations are so high. We see it happen so many times, we know there is an effect. 1972, 24 United States cities were used to conduct an experiment where people were trained to feel the feeling of peace in a very specific manner, and they were strategically placed in these cities. Each city had populations over 10,000 people. And these were documented in some of the very well-known TM studies that were done back in the early 70s. And what happened was, during the time that the people were feeling the feelings of peace, in the community around them, beyond the buildings where they were having their experience, the communities experienced statistically measurable reductions in crime. Violent crimes against people, traffic accidents declined. In some cities like Chicago, where the stock exchanges, the stock market soared while peace was in place. And when they stopped their prayers, all those statistics reversed. And they did this time and time again to such a degree that the effect could be measured, and it was applied in an even greater experiment that was documented in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, 1988. And this was the experiment. It was called the International Peace Project in the Middle East. And what happened during the Israeli-Lebanese War in the early 1980s, as a result of these earlier studies, people who were trained to feel the feelings of peace were positioned throughout the war-torn areas in Israel and Lebanon. And during the time, what the researchers called the window, the prayer window, when they were feeling, people were trained to feel the feelings of peace in their hearts. When they were feeling those feelings, terrorist activities dropped to zero. Crimes against people declined. Emergency hospital room visits declined. And they tried doing these experiments different times of day, different days of the week, to make sure it wasn't an effect of weeks or weekends or holidays, or different times of the month to make sure it wasn't an effect of lunar cycles affecting people. And when the studies were complete, what they found, although we may not know precisely why this effect happens the way it happens, we know the correlations are so high that when a certain number of people begin to feel the feeling of peace or healing in their bodies in one place, the effect carries into the community beyond the place where these people are. And it is so precise that we now know, the statisticians were able to determine precisely the number of people that are required to kickstart, to jumpstart this kind of an effect. So I'll share the formula, and then I'll describe what that formula means. The effect is first noticed when a certain number of people are participating. And that number, the minimum number, is the square root of 1% of a given population. So what does that mean? If you have a city of 1 million people, for example, you take 1% of 1 million on your little calculator, and then you take the square root of whatever that 1% was, and that number tells you how many people are necessary, the threshold number to begin the effect. Obviously, the more people that participate, the greater the effect. For a city of 1 million people, that number is only about 100. In a world of 6 billion people, square root 1% of the given population is only about 8,000 people. 8,000 people, according to these studies, are the number of people, that's all that's required, to feel the feelings of peace in their hearts in a given moment in time simultaneously, to kickstart, to jumpstart that consciousness linked through the field, as we know the field exists today.
During the 1980s, I worked in the defense industry writing software to look for patterns in data. It was during that time that the world experienced one of the most frightening and secretive eras in history, the Cold War, between the superpowers of the United States and the former Soviet Union. With over 70,000 nuclear-tipped weapons poised to strike the largest cities in Europe and North America at a moment's notice, it was also during this time that I found myself searching for a way to make sense of the Cold War and all wars within the context of a bigger picture. Was the Cold War part of a cycle? Could the seemingly random events leading to the wars of the past actually be part of a great, evolving pattern that began long ago? And if such a thing were possible, then do the patterns extend beyond the experience of war into things that happen in our daily lives, like love and betrayal and hurt? If we were to discover that every aspect of our world is part of an ancient and ongoing cycle, such a discovery would give us a powerful new way to think of ourselves. It would imply that everything from the beginnings and the endings of jobs and relationships to the exact year when war is waged and peace is declared are all parts of a cycle, a pattern that makes it possible to reveal the conditions for the future that we've already experienced in the past. Such a vantage point would go a long way in helping us to make sense of our world. It would also be of immense value as we embark upon our journey into the 21st century and find ourselves in the uncharted territory of merging the knowledge and ideas of East and West, ancient wisdom and modern science, to solve the great challenges that threaten our very survival. The key to such a powerful view of time and history is that we can only understand how cycles relate to life by crossing the fuzzy line that's traditionally separated science from the spiritual traditions of our ancestors. For example, when we marry the ancient understanding of time cycles with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Albert Einstein's 20th century discovery of the unity of time and space, something wonderful begins to happen. Einstein's theory of relativity forever merged our ideas of space and time into the single essence called space-time. The events of everyday life, things like romance, war, stock market fluctuations, the rise and fall of civilizations, and so on, all happen within space-time. Things that happen in space-time follow natural rhythms. New discoveries show that we can think of time as an essence that follows the same rhythms and cycles that govern everything from particles to galaxies.
The quantum atom, for that most minute, ultimate particle, we may never find it. Because every time we look, the act of looking is consciousness, placing, creating, building something there for us to see. And when we look into the expanses, the vast expanses of our universe, searching for the very edge of what we call creation, we may never find it. Because the act of consciousness searching is the creative force that puts something in place. Well, growing body, scientific evidence suggests this is precisely the way our world works. And what we'll find as we discover through the experiments that have been done recently in the 20th century is that the ancients may have been very, very close, in fact, to describing precisely the way our world works in the language of another time. Between 1993 and the year 2000, a series of experiments were conducted in accredited scientific and academic institutions that are now supporting precisely the concepts that the ancients so clearly spelled out in the language of their time. 3 of these representative experiments are absolutely shaking the foundation of everything we now believe about physics and the way our world works, and are in fact suggesting that we are connected through this field of energy. The idea that there may be an all-permeating essence that connects everything is really not so new. Even in the world of science, the late 1800s, there was this tremendous spiritual revolution that was sweeping the earth. And at that time, there was a great debate as to whether or not this field actually exists. And during that time, it was called the ether field. In 1887, a very famous experiment was conducted to demonstrate once and for all, does this field exist or does it not exist? And based on the results of that experiment, Western science, specifically Western physics, has believed that everything that happens in our world is discrete, non-related, isolated. Things that appear to be happening in the same instant in time are simply coincidence. The very famous Michelson-Morley experiment, the equivalent of the experiment, is if you were to go outside of the building where you are right now and moisten your finger and place it in the air above your head, and in that moment you felt no wind against your finger, and from that concluded that no air exists around you. That's the equivalent of this Michelson-Morley experiment. They believe that if this field actually exists, it must be moving. And when they tested for movement, they found none, and from that concluded that the field doesn't exist. From 1887 until the early 1990s, all of Western science was based on the principle that what happens in one place has absolutely no effect on what happens somewhere else. And now we know this is absolutely not true. So I'd like to share with you 3 experiments that are absolutely shaking the foundation of Western physics. The first was conducted by a Russian physicist, Vladimir Poponin, in the early 1990s. He came to the United States to finish this series of experiments. And what Poponin did was he wanted to investigate the relationship between human DNA and the stuff our world is made out of, little packets of energy that we call photons, little particles of light, if you want to think of them that way. So the experiment consisted of taking a tube, a glass tube, drawing all the air out of this tube, creating what today we call a vacuum, implying that there's nothing left in this tube. However, we know that there's still something left, these little particles of light. So Poponin measured the particles to see how they were distributed. Did they fly all over the place inside the tube, or were they all accumulated at the bottom, or what happened with them? The results of this part of the experiment were not surprising, because the little particles of light, the photons, were completely random, and this is what they expected. The next part of the experiment is where this gets really, really interesting, because they placed some human DNA into this tube. And the human DNA, when they remeasured the photons, the human DNA had caused the photons to form an alignment. The DNA was having a direct effect on the stuff our world is made of. Now, this is precisely what ancient spiritual traditions have always said. It's something within us has an effect in the world around us. And Poponin's experiment, for the first time in recent times, is actually verifying this under laboratory conditions. And the next piece of the experiment is even more interesting, because what they found was that when the DNA was removed from the tube, we would expect that they would all go back randomly distributed just the way they were before. And this is not what happened. What happened was, even though the DNA was no longer in the tube, the photons remained aligned as if the DNA were still there. And the question is, why? What is it that causes this effect? There's nothing in Western physics that accounts for why those photons should remain in the position that they were in when the DNA that caused them to become aligned is now removed from the tube. This experiment is called the phantom DNA experiment because the effects last whether the DNA is there or not. And what it tells us is, number one, is that DNA is communicating, human DNA is communicating with the stuff our world is made of, the packets of energy that underlie all of matter. It's communicating through a field that has previously been unrecognized. The scientists call it a new field. My sense is it's probably been there all along, and we simply didn't recognize it. So we'll call this a previously unrecognized form of energy. The second experiment, it's a fascinating experiment, it's a military experiment. And what they did, in essence, was they took some human DNA, some scrapings from the tissue of inside the mouth of a donor or volunteer, and they placed this DNA in a device that could measure its effects in one room of a building, while the donor that the DNA came from is in another room in the same building. So living DNA from one person, the DNA is in one place, the volunteer is in another place. And what they did was they subjected the volunteer to what they called emotional stimulation that would elicit genuine responses of emotion, of joy or sadness or fear or anger or rage, in one part of the building, and they were measuring the DNA to see if the DNA would affect to the donor's emotions. Now, why would it? In Western physics today, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that that DNA is still linked to the donor, on the one hand. And on the other hand, as they conducted these experiments, what they found was just the opposite. What they found was that when the donor was having his emotional peaks and valleys in one room, the DNA was having its emotional peaks and valleys in another room at exactly the same time. And we hear about experiments like this, we think of an energy that's being transmitted from point A to point B. And if the energy comes from one place and has to get somewhere else, you would expect that there would be a lag time, a little bit of time between when the emotion is created and when the DNA is responding. That's not what happened. What happened in these experiments, and this is very, very key to where we're going as we begin talking about the power of prayer. What happened in these experiments is that the effects were simultaneous. They were instantaneous. The instant that the donor was having his emotion, the DNA was already affected as if there were no transition time between the two. Well, these experiments were first conducted within rooms that were separated by distances of maybe 50 feet. Later experiments, however, were conducted where the DNA and the donor were separated by hundreds of miles. I had the opportunity to meet the designer of one of these experiments, Dr. Cleve Baxter, and he shared with me one of the experiments that he had designed where the donor was in Los Angeles, but the DNA was in Phoenix, Arizona, almost 400 miles apart. And the effects were precisely the same. Whether they're in the same building or separated by 400 miles, the effect is instantaneous. This opens the door to all kinds of possibilities as to how that DNA remained linked to the donor. What it says to us, once again, is that we're communicating with DNA through our emotions, and that whether the DNA is within our bodies or we're separated by distances of hundreds of miles, the effect is the same. We call this a non-local energy. It means it's everywhere all the time because the energy doesn't have to travel from point A to point B. So the third experiment was conducted again in the early 1990s by the Institute of Heart Math, a pioneering research organization based in Northern California that are exploring the human heart is much more than simply as a pump that moves blood through our bodies. And although our hearts do precisely that, it may be the least of what our hearts do. They're discovering that our hearts are the strongest magnetic field in our bodies, and the electromagnetic field that is produced by our hearts has an effect that extends well beyond our bodies. The Heart Math Institute had earlier discovered that around every human heart there is a field of energy shaped like a tube. It's called a tube torus and extends between 5 and 8 feet beyond the human heart. And the question is, in this already acknowledged field, could there be another form of energy that is being carried by this field beyond our bodies? So they designed an experiment to test precisely this theory. It's no surprise they took some human DNA and they isolated the DNA and asked individuals that were trained to feel what are called coherent human emotions, very clear emotions of love, appreciation, compassion, or anger, rage, hate, to have those feelings on demand. And as the people who were trained to have the feelings did so, they measured the way the DNA responded. And what they found was this. They found that in the presence of appreciation, love, compassion, forgiveness, the DNA became tremendously relaxed. This relaxed state of DNA actually enhances our immune response. When you ask people what it is about the feelings of love and compassion that give us our high immune response, this may begin to tell us why, because the DNA is relaxed and actually allows certain portions of those little switches, if you want to think of them that way, to be enabled or turned on. And just the opposite is true as well. In the presence of anger, rage, hate, jealousy, DNA was tightened like a little knot, and it actually shut down in some instances. Those little switches depleted the immune response. Intuitively, we know this. We know that when people live in a state of jealousy or anger or rage, that depresses those portions of our bodies, and just the opposite, love, compassion, understanding, forgiveness, that those kinds of things are enhanced. And now, perhaps for the first time, these experiments are beginning to help us to understand why. It's the effect of human emotion on what is called the conformation or the shape of the DNA in our bodies. And what these experiments showed, and what the lab results, the lab notes in the published papers actually described, was that very specific kinds of human emotion have the power to change the shape of the DNA in our bodies. This is an amazing thing to say, because what it says is that on demand, when we choose to elicit very specific kinds of feelings and emotions inside of our bodies, we actually have to understand them today. There are so many different traditions from different times in history that seem to converge in our lifetime right now. And when we think about people 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, looking into our time right now, what we're calling this, essentially, they were ancient remote viewers. From their point in history, they were looking along timelines. And if nothing changes in the timeline between them and where we are now, then they were reporting to the best of their ability in the language that was available to them and with the geography available to them, what they saw happening. So what's fascinating to me is the events unfolding in the world in general and in the Middle East specifically are so accurately depicted in some of these ancient prophecies. And two things. First of all, it tells us that these timelines are real, because you can't make this stuff up. I mean, you're looking at, and some of these are biblical, and I'm going to separate the biblical information from the religiosity that developed around them. So some of those are biblical, where they go so far as to identify what nations actually hook up with other nations to converge on the nation of Israel, for example, the geographic locations where they come from. The outcome of all of this tragedy and all this suffering actually leads to something really beautiful that is called 1,000 years of peace. Where I first began to hear about this, I think most people are familiar with the book of Revelation as in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. That book is incomplete. And we get the version that ends with the dark version of what's possible. In the Vatican Library, the second half of the book of Revelation, the good news is not shared by many people. And it's the prophet John that spoke to the powers that be, the angels in heaven, or the community on the mothership, however you want to look at it. And he said, do these things need to happen? Is there another way? And they came back to him and they said, yes, there's always another way. But someone, they said, who on earth is worthy of listening to a greater possibility? And John says, I will. I'll be the one that listens. And he's the one that opens the seals on the books, and it reveals a new earth. For the old earth had disappeared, and it reveals a beautiful time of hope and possibility and thriving and brotherhood and sisterhood and peace among people. And that is the message that's left out. And what the message for the whole book is, it's up to us. It's our choice. So I'm fascinated by these, and I'm also fascinated by the Bible code, or the Torah codes, the mathematic messages that are now being collated through modern computer algorithms based only on the first 5 books of the Old Testament. When you convert the letters into numbers, you load them into the array, and you do the search algorithms, there is the history of the world, and every event that has happened in the world is encoded into those Torah codes. I think it supports the simulation argument, that we're living in a simulation, and that those codes represent the quantum possibilities of everything that could happen, but it's up to us to choose. And so this has been on my mind because so many people feel like there's no other way, and we're locked in to the horrible things that we're seeing, and what we sense is on the horizon that will happen unless we make another choice. We are obviously engaged, and all of these traditions have said I mean, every indigenous tradition I've ever studied, biblical traditions, the Quran, everything says that we are engaged in an ancient battle, for lack of a better term, between good and evil. And as long as we keep engaging on the level that the evil presents itself, that's what keeps us locked into the ancient trap that perpetuates the very conditions that we hope to transcend. The evidence suggests greater than not that we're living in a simulation, that we're in a virtual environment, and that the code for that virtual environment lives within each of us. It may be that the events of the world drive us to transcend, not to battle one-on-one, good on evil, but to transcend that polarity. And that's how we shift the timeline. And the technology, I'm familiar with Frank's work. I've never spoken with him directly, but we know of one another's work. It's interesting because the technology that he's talking about, governments may have it now, but it was originally in possession of the Vatican, was who discovered the inventor that created the technology, and they used it to go backward in time to validate the existence of Jesus and what they saw, and then they went forward, and what they saw is why the government stepped in and shut them down. If we're going to get through this, we're going to have to think differently. And I think that difference may drive us into feeling and sensing into a new reality that carries us into that new timeline. And again, it doesn't have to be, we were just on Quartet, and we talked about this. And I saw this, I've seen this in physics. It's really interesting. And I always use the example of a rocket launch from Earth to the moon. If you're off just, a little bit on Earth, by the time that rocket reaches the moon, that little distance is translated, you're going to miss the mark. All we need is enough of a shift to move us off of that mark so that we can begin on a new timeline, on that new trajectory. When I dive into this, I think there's something even more profound that's happening. Rather than splitting off and leaving this old world and we go into this new world, I think the message of the resurrection, the message of transfiguration, is that we shift this world from within to become a different world rather than leaving this world and going somewhere to a better world. I think we're looking at the potential of transforming this world, a resurrection on a mass scale. And to do that is where we transcend this polarity between the good and evil. And it's hard to do because of what we see happening in the world right now. I think there's a level where the battle has to play out, but I think there are tactics in that battle. And again, I go back, it seems hopeless unless now you apply the science that says there's over a 90% probability that we're in a virtual reality. And that virtual reality, you learn the rules of the physics of that virtual reality, and then you can engage the game in a very, very different way. I think that's the movies that we're creating that we call entertainment, I think are telling us, this is our subconscious reminding us through what we call entertainment of something that is dormant and perhaps forgotten within us. I think this is us informing ourselves, consciousness informing itself. So we begin doing this by approaching, and this is, some people call this splitting hairs. So there's a battle. I believe there's always a time when you can avoid the battle. And when the momentum, when the reaches beyond the threshold, then you're in it. And the only way out of it is to go through it. What does the battle make us become? What does the battle do to us? How do we approach that battle? If we approach the battle from the perspective of hate and revenge, then we've succumbed to the darkness, and the darkness is won. If we can engage in that battle from the love of what we know is possible in the world that we know is possible in our hearts, we're still fighting, but we're fighting from a different perspective, and we become a different person. There are some people that say, Greg, you're splitting hairs. What difference does it make? The battle is still the battle. And the answer is yes. However, on a spiritual level, it's like night and day. On a spiritual level, do we fight that battle and become the best version of ourselves in doing that? And what does the information that we're seeing on our YouTube channel make us into? What is it doing to us? What does it allow us to become? That's the battle right there. I think the value of a simulation theory is it gives us a new vocabulary from which to think about very ancient and polarized religious ideas. We're somewhere else projecting into these avatars, into these bodies that are mostly empty space to begin with. We're somewhere else, and there are rules that govern that simulation and how it unfolds. But as a computer scientist, what I know is this: a simulation has a beginning and an end. And there are a number of ways that can end a simulation. It can be a data overload when you run out of space. We're creating so much digital information to be held in this system. Maybe we're going to have some kind of an overload, or the simulation may, on a cyclic basis, go through a reset. And what you're talking about, I believe, could be the catalyst for the reset. The difference is that instead of us all leaving, we live through the reset and we begin a new simulation. What I think is so interesting is so many of, whether you're talking about indigenous Native American prophecy or you're talking about biblical prophecy, and many people believe these are what we're living are end times prophecies, or you're talking about the mathematics, the statistical mathematics of the Torah code that are beyond anything that could happen by coincidence. There's something was given to our world 3,000 years ago that has a record of every possibility. It doesn't predict what will happen. When you query it, it will give you relationships. What we may be awakening to is that we're not locked in to a series of events that our leaders have chosen. And people say, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to go and fight in the Middle East? No. When we choose to not let the events of one another get through this, I don't want to bail.